Welcome to Light It Up, a podcast about resilient women balancing motherhood, their careers, personal lives, and all of the challenges that come along with being a superwoman. Each week, you'll be motivated to take action to lead, inspire, transform, and empower. Now, here's your host, Dr. Aginah Musherah. Today, I am joined by author Kai Kaaron. She is one of several authors of the newly published book, Domestic Violence, Love Was a Battlefield, Stories of Survivors. Welcome to Light It Up, Kai. How are you?
I am great, and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming on to the podcast. If you could just tell the audience just a little bit about yourself. I know that you are a Chicago native, but if you could, talk about your profession and your background.
So my background is actually completely unrelated to writing. I'm a massage therapist by trade. I am a Chicago native, but I relocated to Georgia when I was 22, and that's where I attended massage school. And I've been practicing first in Georgia, Tennessee, and now back in Chicago for 19 years.
Wow. Okay. So let's just kind of dive right into you're a massage therapist by profession, but obviously you have a love and a passion for writing because you recently published your story in an anthology. So this is a collection of stories with other authors.
Yes.
Is this your first published work, or have you published other books or publications?
So this is my first time being published. It is not my first time writing.
Okay. Okay. So how long have you been writing?
I began writing when I was, I think, 4 years old. My mom kept my very first story, which is about a paragraph long, about a princess. But my love of writing began young because of my love of reading began young. I come from a creative family full of writers and storytellers and artists. And my mom enjoyed writing song lyrics. We were not musicians, but so there was plenty of that creative energy surrounding me and plenty of opportunity to express myself in that way.
Okay. All right. So this book, I had an opportunity to read your chapter, and so I couldn't put it down. So that's absolutely great. But the topic is a very serious topic. It's a topic, of domestic violence. So if you could just tell the listeners what made you decide as your first published work to write about domestic violence?
Well, my friend Sam Swain is the editor and the creative collaborator for this anthology, and she put the call out there. It was very much a spur of the moment type of decision. I saw the opportunity. I'm like, you know what? I'm going to do this. Mm-hmm. And I don't know that I ever really intended informally telling my story, but I've always used it as a platform. Every year on that date, I always speak on it to my friend group. And I just thought it was important to share my story because it is unique.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, we want people to read your story. So
yes,
I know your story, and I won't go into too much detail in terms of asking questions, so you won't give everything away. But for you, I guess experiencing a relationship or being in a domestic abusive relationship, was it a relationship where this was a consistent pattern, or was this, you know, were there different, you know, events that kind of led up to, um, I guess, an explosive episode, so to speak?
So the pattern is unique, as I mentioned, because there was only one violent episode. And in my previous experience, that's all I knew about domestic violence. I really had no relevant experience because it's not something I was really around. I never really got to observe it directly on an ongoing basis. And so it came as a surprise to me at the time. But in hindsight, there was a clear pattern of mental abuse and psychological abuse and control.
And I think it's interesting, you know, that you pointed out that from your experience in terms of what you may have saw or witnessed or maybe heard about from other people's experience, you know, when you think of domestic violence, you usually think about physical abuse. You don't necessarily think about the mental, psychological, or even verbal abuse for that matter. And then there's another aspect that people probably don't think about, and that's the financial control that maybe one partner may have within the relationship. And that's also a form of domestic violence, or it, you know, a part of it. So could you just kind of tell us or share with us, you know, what is domestic violence? We know about the physical abuse, but what exactly, for those who may not really understand the definition of domestic violence, can you share that with us?
So now I'm no expert, but how I would describe domestic violence is a situation in which one person exercises control over another. It is systematic. So it almost never happens in isolation and just one single instance. It's always systematic because one person has to wear down, in essence, or create a situation in which the second person is willing to accept the behavior. So it's about power, it's about control, and it might not even be an intentional desire to hurt the person. It's just that power and that control. They have to have control over the situation, including another human being.
Yeah. In your situation, did you, I know you mentioned, you know, hindsight certainly is 2020, but did you see any warning signs throughout your relationship before it led to that one incident of violence?
So there were many instances. The control began as soon as I was completely, you know, vulnerable, in essence. And so it was during the vulnerable times that I really saw the worst, I guess you could say. Times that you would think in a healthy relationship, you'd have more support from your mate. And that's when, like I said, the mental, the psychological stuff was taking place. And so obviously at the time, I really wasn't seeing it clearly. And it was not until after everything happened and I was able to receive some assistance from the police department, and that I became aware of something called the cycle of abuse. And I never knew, you know, so as they broke it down to me, you know, it just became clearer and clearer that the what I thought were, you know, single instances of his, you know, poor treatment of me or a poor decision on his part. No, it was like I said, systematic, and so it was eye opening. but I didn't
Yeah.
see it at the time.
Yeah. And it also seems like, just from the story that you shared, there may have been some other issues even within the family, because, you know, there were some instances where, just with the verbal, or, comments that were made against you by, one of the family members or what have you. And I know a lot of times, when we're in relationships, sometimes you can see just by how people interact with their family. And I recall reading where you met his family, and there was just something about, just the communication, the level of communication, that caused you to take pause, because you came from a family where everybody kind of got along,
Right.
talked or what have you. So um, during that time, did you have a support system or anyone that you could um, lean on when you were experiencing, just some levels of uncertainty or vulnerability, where maybe you could have reached out to somebody to kind of say, hey, I'm kind of experiencing some things here, just to kind of talk to someone? Or what was that like for you?
So I did have the advantage of my mom being with me. And, but unfortunately, it also meant that she was going through the emotional ringer with all of this as well,
Mm-hmm.
because she was disabled.
Mm-hmm.
And so she was fully dependent upon me, and I became fully dependent upon him. So I felt like my family, my daughter and my mom, kind of just went for the ride along with me. And my mom was a sweet and very forgiving type of person. She wanted to see the best. Um, and and also, I don't think she had any direct experience with abuse either, you know? So I know that had she thought this was mental or psychological, that she would have mentioned it, because she didn't bite her tongue.
Yeah.
Like I said, we had a very communicative
Mm-hmm.
family. So I don't think she saw it for what it was either.
Yeah. So how was it for you writing writing your story? You can go through something, and a lot of times, you know um, we can find situations that we're in therapeutic if we journal or write about it. How was this experience for you as you were writing your story?
Well, it was very emotional. There were so many parts of my story I had to go into detail with, and I intentionally didn't go into detail on some other parts that were just so sensitive to me at this time, even now, years later.
Mm-hmm.
So, what it made me realize is that I hadn't yet worked through everything. I didn't receive um, counseling after the incident. So busy trying to shelter my daughter
Mm-hmm.
from, details. Uh, but in essence, what I failed to do is get the help that I probably needed at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So I've only uh, connected with other survivors, and I've discussed my story that way. But what telling my story, especially going into great detail with some things, it made me, for one, see connections that I don't know that I really made prior to putting it together. I'm like, oh my gosh, well, there it was,
Mm-hmm.
which is why I thought it was very important to share the story, because I know there are young women out there who probably aren't seeing it yet. And we call them red flags, but it was even beyond a red flag. It was actual instances of abuse.
Mm-hmm.
But because we don't label it as such in our society, at least we don't educate young women about this. So I feel like it's important, but it's the duty of a survivor to share their testimony, because other people may never know otherwise.
And you know what? It's so interesting that you say that, because I and I don't talk about it now, but there was a time, I think I was, I don't know, I think I may have been 20 or 21, and I dated someone. And at the time, I thought I was so in love with him, thought he was just the best person ever, thought I was going to marry him. But no one in my family liked him. My
Oh,
friends didn't like him. But he had like this air about himself where I thought of him as being very assertive and confident.
mm,
He was a little arrogant, you know, but it got to the point where I was isolated, you know, from my family and friends, not entirely, but I questioned any opinion that they had of this individual. And at the
right.
time, I didn't think that it was going to lead to, like you say, there was one incident. But then when I go back and I thought about some of the things that transpired with the psychological and emotional abuse, you know, and you're right, we don't label it as that. And and I certainly was one who I can remember always saying, like, I would never let somebody put their hands on me, you know. And then you wonder, like, how did I get to this point? How did I get, you know, in this situation?
Right.
Um, when after you got out of your situation, um, did you ever disclose to anyone? Did you share with anybody what you had gone through, or did you kind of keep it to yourself and later share your experience?
So, the first person that I talked to when it happened was my aunt, and she lived in Georgia at the time, and so she drove up quickly to be by my side as I attended. You know, we had several court appearances, so she was there for immediate support. I did tell her about, you know, what I could recall as being major, you know, factors before it got to that physical point.
Mm-hmm.
And uh, I didn't go into great detail with like my cousins, for example, because I was afraid that they would try to take a more confrontational
Mm-hmm.
stance,
Yeah.
and I didn't think that was safe for anybody.
Right. Yeah.
So I was like, you know, I'm going to let this court situation play itself out, and I felt like I had to get justice. I believe there are natural and sometimes unnatural consequences for your actions, and so I thought it was important. I think even at that point, having removed myself from the relationship, I still cared enough that I'm like, he needs help.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought that, you know, we can at least see it all the way through. I wasn't bound to any outside pressures to drop charges or cover for him,
Mm-hmm.
because to me, I was like you. I always said, no man will ever put his hands on me, or if he did, it'd be the last time. So
Mm-hmm.
it happened, and
Mm-hmm.
at least it was the last time.
Right.
So I'm glad that at least I stuck to that.
Yeah. With your book, if you could just kind of share just I guess, a brief synopsis of your story. Um,
Um, so I would say, to keep it brief,
mhm,
it's the story of a young woman who thought she had found the one,
mhm,
and who was willing to give up everything to be with him. And he found herself slowly but surely chiseled away, like the self confidence, the security that, you know, most young women seek in a relationship, and that was slowly being chiseled away. Um, and so, in inevitability, it came to a physical point, um, and she made the decision to leave. So that's I guess the best summary.
mhm. Well, because I don't want you to give away too much
Right.
of your story. Has it been how, I guess, how has your experience, like moving forward from that relationship, how has your perspective changed in terms of any other future relationships that you may have had? You know what I mean? Because it's like you had this experience that you were not expecting, not prepared for, right?
Right.
And then when you get out of that type of situation, because you had so much more that was happening in your life too, aside from, you know, this particular incident. Um, how how did your perspective change on just moving forward with any other relationships after this?
So, okay, this is funny. So immediately after,
Mhm.
I ended up in a uh, rebound relationship. You know, I mean, just I'll just call it as it is.
Yeah.
He was actually a friend of mine, and he was more than happy to assume that role of support during this time. But even then, I felt like it wasn't healthy because I wasn't healthy, and so it did affect me in terms of. So I went from being that quiet person in the relationship, not wanting to ruffle feathers, not wanting to uh, create disagreement, to the polar opposite, too assertive, combative. I mean, I stood up for myself for small things after that, and so that was one.
Mhm.
But I feel like I haven't been in the best mental space because of all of this. I haven't worked through everything. And so, I've dated, I've been in some relationships since then.
Mhm.
Uh, None of them were particularly healthy.
Mhm.
And so I've chosen to remain single for now
Mhm. Yeah.
because, you know, there's a lot that I need to work through. And then there needs to be um, a point where, I am willing to make myself vulnerable again.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
I do find myself a little more combative. I do find myself standing up for myself, and uh, I'm noting red flags a whole lot sooner because
Mhm.
trust me, they have popped up,
Mhm.
and my tolerance now is so different. Where I put up with that for 8 years, now I won't tolerate it for 1 year. I won't tolerate it for 6 months.
It was 8 years?
That was 8 years.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Wow. Um, that's I'm just thinking about, when you get to the point where you finally say like enough is enough. You know what I mean? Um, because and I think that happens to in relationships to so many of us. We finally get to the point, sometimes we try to make adjustments for the person that we're involved in a relationship with, or sometimes we may make excuses or say maybe they were having a bad day or they're under stress, they're under pressure. um, but then when you finally make that decision that you've had enough, I think it can be a combination of, I mean, there's this level of having this burden lifted, but at the same time, like you don't know what to expect, in terms of your future going forward. Um, when you were, I know, writing your chapter for the anthology brought up a lot of emotions. Um, were you able to maybe reflect upon, um, I guess, how what your path would be to becoming totally healed? Because obviously, when you go through any type of traumatic situation or experience, you may think that you're okay, and in some ways that you're not. But I guess if you could, on a scale 1 to 10, would you be able to say where you are in terms of your healing process?
Well, I mean, I've come a long way from where I was.
Mhm.
Um, but I've definitely got a ways to go. I would say on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm probably at maybe a 5 or 6. I've still got a ways to go.
Mhm. And how did this experience? I mean, your daughter was um, probably young, right, at the
Yes.
time. Did did it impact her? Did she really know what was going on or what was happening, um, or were you able to shield her from, some of the things that were happening? And what type of impact did it have on her?
So unfortunately, I obviously did make a lot of effort to shield her. She was only 10, or I'm sorry, 11 at the time.
Yeah.
She was 11. Um, and I thought I was shielding her. I didn't talk about it in front of her. That night, I tried to shield her from discussions with the cops. She didn't. I thought she didn't exactly know what was going on. That's not altogether true,
Mm-hmm.
and she did realize at least some of it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I know that it did impact her. If not for the direct effect, every time that I went through the emotional ringer, I mean, everything was left in limbo and uncertain for her.
Mm-hmm.
So there was that. And then after everything, and we had to uh, uproot our lives again,
Mm-hmm.
and everything changed because he served the role as her father. I mean, he was a very present father figure.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was no goodbye. There was never a transition for her. It was just one day we were together, and next day we weren't, with no further contact.
Yeah.
And so it has been difficult. It definitely has been difficult for her. And, so I know that children that are involved in these situations sometimes, end up making poor decisions themselves in choosing their, mates.
Yeah.
We haven't come to that, thank God.
Mm-hmm.
But I do understand how it can affect her on that deeper level, subconscious level.
Yeah. I mean, and I think as mothers, I mean, of course, we're the primary caregiver, and we want to protect our children, but they can sense so much of what we're experiencing when we think that we are protecting them or keeping, certain things away from them. And there was something that I didn't point out when we first started this conversation. When you met your former partner, you guys were living in separate states.
Yes.
And it was when you mentioned that everything was uprooted. And so you moved to where he was when you all had finally made the decision to be together before.
Exactly.
Yeah. So even with that, I mean, it seems like the perfect setting, so to speak. If you were dealing with someone who's isolating, you were in a new state where you didn't have any family or friends, although your mom and your daughter were with you, but you were in what one would deem as a perfect isolated situation.
For sure.
Yeah.
It was like like you said, it was a perfect scenario.
Mm-hmm.
I suddenly became dependent. I went from being very independent,
Mm-hmm.
and then suddenly I had given all that up.
Yeah.
And I was willing to at the time, because I thought, again, this was the one, this was it, but yeah, like I said, hindsight, you're right, that created just a perfect storm.
Mm-hmm.
And so many times when I reflect on this, I'm like, man, I never should have left Georgia. I never should have left Georgia, because I was very content there. And we had a life for ourselves there.
Yeah.
But when we moved, it was impossible to make friends. So I didn't really have friends unless they were moms of my daughter's friends.
Mm-hmm.
And so I didn't have any tight bonds. And so, yeah, I think a lot of what happened in that house stayed in that house because there wasn't anyone local really to lean on.
Mm-hmm. What is it with this, as far as domestic violence is concerned, what do you think is the greatest misconceptions about victims who are in abusive relationships?
Something that I see often are people blaming the victims. She's stupid. Why'd she stay? And so that is the biggest misconception I think people have about victims, that it's a conscious choice.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't understand the cycle of abuse and how the abuser they cycle through mental, first they start there, they isolate, they control, then it escalates into a physical altercation, or sometimes it doesn't escalate to that point, but it escalates to another type of abuse.
Mm-hmm.
And then they make up.
Mm-hmm.
Promise they'll never do it again. So you let your guard down, you take them back, and it keeps cycling. It continues to cycle. But the key aspects of that are the mental aspects, the emotional aspects, and the control. Because without those in play, a victim most likely would have not tolerated it. But this has been worked on. They primed the pump, so to say. So they created the perfect victim. So I think people don't have enough compassion for victims because they don't understand.
Mm-hmm. And and one thing to point out is, even in these situations, it's not as if, when you talk about the cycle of violence, it's not like, this is something that's occurring every day.
Exactly.
It could be months later. You think everything's good, you're in the honeymoon phase, there are no issues.
Yeah.
And then bam, something happens. And I don't know if people really understand that also when thinking about the victim, when people victim blame and say, well, why did she stay? And for that matter, why did he stay? Because we do know that men can be victims of abuse. But
Yes.
I don't think that people really reflect upon the fact that this isn't something that's going on a daily basis or
Right.
weekly in most situations. It could be months, before there's anything that ever transpires in terms
Right.
of the explosive phase. Um, for those who are listening or who have friends, what advice, who may be in an abusive relationship, what advice would you give to someone who is currently in an abusive relationship? And what advice would you give to family or friends of victims on what they can do to help the victims?
So to the victims, so if you recognize yourself in my story or one of the other stories in the anthology, because sometimes you don't recognize it, you don't see it for what it is. So first you have to see it clearly, and once you've recognized yourself, excuse me, once you've recognized yourself in that, you got to make a plan. The first thing is to reach out to someone, whether that's a family member, trusted family member, trusted friend, or a hotline, a domestic violence organization, because many times victims are like me and they're stuck. Leaving wasn't just something I could do, and most victims cannot, whether it's because of financial reasons or they're afraid for their lives. So, we talk so much about leaving as if that's just an easy thing, but just one decision. Oh, sure, I'll leave. But it's a dangerous prospect, actually. And so I feel like there needs to be a plan in place. But it begins by reaching out. Keeping it to yourself is probably the most dangerous thing you can do. Then you're just protecting your abuser. But if you're ready to protect yourself and your children or whoever else might be going through that situation with you, you gotta reach out. Someone else needs to know, even if you do it anonymously to begin with. Gotta reach out. And for friends and family who are witnessing it, and maybe they didn't know what they were seeing at first, or maybe they bought the excuses that the victim gave them for the behavior. Uh, I think that they're in a special position in order to help the victim with that plan to escape. Again, I say plan because so first you have to figure out where you're going to go. Right. You have to figure out how you're going to foot the bill for where you're going. You have to make sure that there's an order of protection in place. And then how do you protect yourself if he violates that order? So there are many things to consider. If you're legally married, there's, communal property. There's the children's custody you have to be concerned with, because are you going to share custody with an abuser? Mm-hmm. So there is so much to consider. And so friends and family are in that unique position where they can educate themselves and they can offer their services, whether that is, hey, you can always come here. Or like, sometimes it's let's go to the shooting range. Let's learn how to shoot that weapon you've got,
Yeah.
Or like, you know what, let's slowly start moving things out so that he doesn't notice. Put it, don't carry it in a suitcase, we'll put them in small bags and slowly but surely start moving your things out so that you can leave overnight if you need to. Mm-hmm. So that I feel is a role, a very important role that friends and family can play.
And with this book, Domestic Violence, Love Was a Battlefield, I mean, I love the title of it as well. What do you hope that readers will get from not only your story, but from all of the other authors' stories that's shared?
Well, the first thing, I hope that they can learn some of the patterns of abusers and learn how to recognize it in either their own relationships or in those that they know. And I hope that it also humanizes victims so that they can have that compassion that's necessary to reach out and to want to help. In addition, we have the story of an abuser in our anthology. And so I think that this is a great gift for not just someone going through a domestic violence situation, but maybe the person that is the perpetrator. That there is another side of it. You can come out on the other side of it. You don't have to always be that way. You can learn to control your anger, and you can learn healthy communication, and empathy for others.
Where can we get the book?
So the book is available on Amazon. It's again, Domestic Violence, Love Was a Battlefield, Stories of Survivors. You do a quick search, will pop up.
Perfect. And do you have any plans, since you're a published author now, you have any plans of publishing any more work?
This was extremely motivational.
Yeah.
I have been trying to get published since I was a teenager. And back then, you had to go to the library, you got this big, giant book of publishers out, you got to open it up and you try to find, the ones that cater to your genre, and you needed an agent and you needed a lot of money.
Yeah.
And so now we're in a very unique position that we can self-publish, and it can go straight from the writer's hand to the reader's hand just that quickly. So it's been extremely motivational, and I've learned a lot through the process. And so yes, I have works that have just been gathering dust for decades, and so I will be continuing to publish.
Perfect. That's good to know. Definitely will be on the lookout for your next published work. With this, do you also have any plans of maybe talking about and sharing your story on a broader scale? I know you mentioned that every year, which marks the anniversary, I guess, of the date that you had this experience, that you kind of share your story, but you could certainly use this as a platform to reach, other people. Have you thought about going out and giving talks. I know right now we're not going anywhere,
Right.
but maybe one day soon. But have you thought about that or have any plans?
You know, I have thought about it. I don't have any plans currently, but I definitely have thought about it. Like, what can my message be on a more national or even international stage? Because I have had these many years of speaking on it just on Facebook, but you know, that's an audience of about 1,200.
Right.
So it's helped me to understand how this plays out in many different environments.
Mm-hmm.
So you have some cultures that support this type of behavior
Mm-hmm.
and what those women can do to escape. You have, we live in a climate where sex trafficking is like at astronomical rates. I mean, we've not had this many people in slavery ever in
Right.
history.
Yeah.
And so recognizing that because now more awareness has been, you know, promoted about narcissism, people are understanding narcissistic personality disorder a little better and seeing that in their loved ones, because oftentimes narcissists do end up being abusers.
Yeah.
If not physically, they certainly do emotionally.
Right.
For
right.
sure.
Absolutely.
So I think that you know, I am obligated in a way to continue to contribute to that conversation. You know, I don't have the expertise, and but I can talk from a very personal point of view, because my motto has been, "If I got out, you can't too." So I feel like, you know, that is an ongoing message that I will continue to spread, because honestly, most people hide it and you wouldn't know. And so it takes hearing it over and over and over again from different points of view.
Yeah, I think transparency is so important and so crucial because, you know, you could have someone, like you said, people hide it, and you could be friends with someone and not know that they're in this type of situation. But if we are more open to share our experiences, it will probably help those who are, you know, going through a situation like this, talk about it, you know, to reach out to someone to get some type of support to try to get out of the situation. And it could be, I think it could be very embarrassing too, because, you know, if you're reflecting on, well, how did I get myself into this situation? And sometimes you can be subjected to your own victim blaming, you know, blaming yourself, you know, what did I do wrong, or what was it that I did to cause this situation, when of course it's not, you know, the victim's fault at all. But I know, or I'll just share from personal experience, you know, I even went through that period where I thought, well, maybe it was something that I did that caused this. So I think definitely sharing your story, sharing your experience is very important. Years ago, when I worked for the sheriff's department, we actually put together a teen dating violence program. And we went out to junior high. I think it may have been high school. So I don't think we actually targeted junior high students, but high school students. And the program was called He Loves Me, He Loves Me Not. And, and I don't know if, because I'm no longer in that area, whether or not teen dating violence is even discussed, you know, anymore. I don't necessarily hear anything about it, but I know it certainly does occur in different forms.
Right.
So, you know, even if having a platform where you can reach, you know, young adults as well would be great. And sharing it on Facebook, folks are, you know, will certainly share your message. So I'm sure more than 1,200 people are getting, getting the message. You know what I mean? I mean, that's just the platform that definitely, whether they hear your message today or whether they hear it months from now, as long as you utilize the different platforms that are available to kind of get the word out and talk to people, I think that that's very important. So is there anything else that you'd like to share about the book, about your experience as an author? Any closing remarks?
I'd highly recommend the book. These are very honest stories. You mentioned transparency, and that is something that, we all chose to do. And I think that there's a lot to gain from reading the book, even if you don't have any direct experience with it or don't know anyone. It's good knowledge to have. It comes from different perspectives, totally different experiences. And I still feel that empathy toward victims is still lacking in our culture as a whole. And so I think this is just an important contribution to promoting that compassion. You talked about self-blame. I think that personally, I don't know if I went through a self-blame period as much as I did try to reflect back and see where I went wrong. And I think that that can be valuable because it gives you the opportunity to take a step back and to assess the situation, your role in it too. Not that I'm saying it's ever the victim's fault. It's not ever the victim's fault. I don't care how mad he is. He doesn't have a right to touch you.
Right.
And the control, the mental, the emotional, all of that is not the victim's fault. That is a choice that the abuser made. So I did want to reiterate that. But yeah, I think that this story is an important reflection, self-reflection, because it, from my perspective, it gave me a chance to go back and reflect on all the little things that added up to the big thing. And I felt that most victims experience a lot of the little things before it gets to the big stuff.
Yeah.
And they don't identify it as such. And so it's so important to start recognizing that the things you probably consider red flags are very much so. And if you can catch it before it ever gets to that point, probably the safest time to leave. But I also want to encourage people that no matter what, currently in Chicago, Uber and Lyft have a partnership with the mayor's office, so that if you want to get up and leave right now, you can get a free ride on Uber and Lyft, and they'll take you wherever you want to go. They have established new sheltering in hotels because the shelters are full. They are trying their best because they recognize that during this quarantine, abuse numbers are just at historic highs. Suddenly, people are sheltering in place with their abusers. They don't have a means of escape. Their abuser's not leaving to go to work. They can't leave to go to work. They don't have a good enough excuse to even get out of the house at all anymore. And so, especially now, I feel that there's never been a better time for us to start having really open dialogue about what this is, what it looks like, what it can look like, and how to be free from it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was one of the reasons that I tried to tackle this topic, is because we're sheltering in place. It's been about 8-9 weeks now. I can't even keep up, but just seeing the news reports and just even reflecting upon that, like, you're right. You don't have an excuse to be able to try to get out of the house now, and you're stuck as a victim with your abuser. And I just, we are really living in some very challenging times right now. So thank you for sharing those resources about Uber and Lyft, and then of course the hotels that are now serving as shelters. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned, of course, red flags. Do you have any red flags that you would like to share with us that, we could be on the lookout for? Of course, it's going to be different for different people, but are there any that you think that we should be on the lookout for?
So there's, I would say, several red flags. The first may be, are you being isolated from your friends and family? Have you lost financial control? That might mean you're a stay-at-home mom. It might mean you just don't have access to the bank account. And how does he express himself? Does he have trouble communicating except for anger? How does he diffuse his anger? Does he choose to yell, and or does he bottle it all up? I mean, neither is a healthy way of expressing anger. So communication is huge. How do you all communicate? Are you able to talk to him about things that bother you without fear? A lot of times abusers are very charming to outsiders. Do you see that? Do you see that switch where he can be this completely pleasant person that everyone else looks up to, but at home is he someone different? Are there less obvious threats? Does he like to flaunt weapons in front of you? Does he threaten your stability in terms of, where you live or things that you need? Is he restricting things for you? Does he limit your phone conversations? Does he have to know where you are at every moment of the day? Does he show suspicion on a regular basis? Is he very distrusting for no reason at all? So I think that all of these are things we can look out for. And many of them appear right away. Even after this situation, I ended up in another relationship briefly that I started seeing these red flags, but I was no longer afraid to talk about it. So I called him out on it a lot, and he would get so angry. It wasn't a normal response to stuff. Like, he seemed to not be able to express himself outside of anger. He was huge at gaslighting. This is another red flag, gaslighting. That you're making a bigger deal out of this than it actually is. Or shifting the blame. You made me do that. So, these are all major red flags.
You have another book. You do. You got several workshops that you could do too. So
hey, I'm definitely open.
Well, I certainly thank you for taking time to talk about your experience, but also to talk about the book. Again, I'm very excited for you. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Becoming a published author. It's a very exciting time for you. So thank you very, very much for being so transparent and sharing with us. And of course, we're going to continue the conversation very soon.
Very soon.
Yeah. You and the other authors are going to be on, but I thought it was important to have you on because your story comes first in the book.
That's true.
As well. And of course, we have our connection of Morgan Park. So
Morgan Park High School, MP High.
That's right. Definitely got to support my Morgan Park family. So I thank you so very much, Kay, for coming on to Light It Up. And I always leave my guests with these this phrase of make sure that you continue to light it up and shine bright like a diamond. So,
thank you very much, Aginah.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining me this week on Lite It Up. Make sure you visit my website at www.liteituppodcast.com or www.aginahmuhammad.com. You can also find me on social media using the handle @LiteItUpPodcast. If you like what you've heard, please be sure to hit the subscribe button so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, I'd appreciate a rating on iTunes, or you can simply tell a friend about the show. Be sure to tune in every Tuesday for a new episode. Until next time, light it up and shine bright like a diamond.